Welcome to the Food for Thought podcast. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Just a reminder that this podcast is listener supported. So if it's something you value and you'd like to join me and my community of amazing subscribers, head over to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. You can also just go right to joyfulvegan.com and click on the little donate button. Choose your level and join me where I share additional content, more intimate content, more personal content, and where we explore and have conversations together. Thank you so much in advance for supporting this podcast, for subscribing, and for listening, and for leaving ratings and reviews. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I'll keep the announcements short. I know many of you who follow me on social media and subscribe to my mailing list already know this. I lost Charlie, our cat Charlie, on November 9th. We let him go after a very quick and sudden and unexpected bout of pancreatitis, which we actually know now wasn't a bout. He probably had it for longer than we realized. And in the end, there was nothing more we could do for him. And it was very shocking and painful, and it still is. In the end, it was probably pancreatic cancer. And I will be doing a podcast episode on grieving. I have done one in the past when I lost my cat Simon, and I've talked about Schuster as well. And I have been meaning to do another one. And frankly, this is one that I will do in honor of Charlie, but also because I do know that this is a universal experience, loss. And I am really grateful that the past episode I did on losing Simon, people have told me that it really helped them through their own grief, and that is so meaningful to me. So I do plan on doing another episode on grief, but not today. Today, that is not this day. So thanks for all of your well wishes and sympathy and kindness and compassion. I know that most of us, if we've had any loved ones, have experienced loss. So I know I'm not alone, and I know it's a journey and a process, and I'm letting it come, and it's here. It's a lot of up and down, a lot of emotions, and I'm working through it. So thanks for that. We're leaving for Rwanda on Thursday. I am really grateful that we had a couple weeks in between losing Charlie and leaving for our trip. This is a joyful vegan trip to Rwanda, because I obviously would not have wanted to leave right away after losing Charlie, because I wanted to make sure Michiko was doing well, and she's doing great. I'll talk more about that in the episode on grief and losing our companions, because I think this is going to be one of those situations where one cat changes when another cat leaves or when another cat comes in. I think it's more of a situation with cats, but I'm sure those of you who have dogs have probably experienced something like this before. Charlie was a very dominant personality. He was very present. His absence is very noticeable in this house. And I think Schuster, I have done this a million times, and I'm not going to edit myself. Ever since Charlie got sick, I have been calling Michiko Schuster and Charlie Simon. It's bizarre, and I cannot believe it comes out of my mouth without me realizing it. So I will start that sentence again. It's so bizarre. And I'll talk about that in the podcast episode on grief as well. It's bizarre. There's this association with Michiko and Schuster and Charlie and Simon, and they did have similarities, each of those pairs. But it's bizarre. I keep doing this. So Michiko is doing great. Michiko, I think, is much more relaxed without Charlie in the house, because he was very dominant, and there's more to say about that. But she's doing really, really well. I'm just so pleased, and she's just such a love muffin. She is the easiest cat. And so I had to rewrite the instructions for our house sitter and our cat sitter, because obviously there were more instructions when it was two cats and when it was Charlie. So I was finding myself just deleting a lot of things that I don't have to tell her about, because she's so well behaved and Charlie sometimes was not. And I had to kind of explain things that Charlie would have gotten into that Michiko just doesn't get into. And Schuster was the same way. Schuster just didn't get into anything, and Simon did. Well, Michiko doesn't get into anything, and Charlie did. So it's just a lot quieter here. And I think Michiko feels that. So she's doing really, really well. And we have our sitter coming, actually, as I'm recording this, tomorrow night. She arrives and then stays overnight, and we leave the next day. So we're very excited. Rwanda is a very special place. It is the 5th time we'll be doing this tour, and I'm really excited to bring another group of people to this incredible country, to see the mountain gorillas, to see the chimpanzees, to see the golden monkeys, to visit the genocide memorials, to experience the beauty of this country and its people. So excited about that, but I really wanted to get this episode out before we left, or at least recorded before we left, because I really wanted to get this episode out in the wake of the most recent US election. And I wanted to get it out to you for the holidays, because I think there's so much to say. There's so much to say. So the last thing I'll say before I get into today's episode is, if you are interested in being notified when my book called A Year of Compassion, 52 Weeks of Living Zero Waste, Plant-Based, and Cruelty-Free comes out for pre-order, you can go to joyfulvegan.com/pre-order, and I would really appreciate it. Pre-orders really mean a lot for new books, and it's not available yet for pre-order, but it will be, and as soon as it is, anyone on that list will be notified, so you can pre-order the book and make it a bestseller. So thank you so much for that. Let's get started. In today's episode, I am stepping into challenging and important, one might even say dangerous territory, to address a few things. Number one, how to engage with people whose beliefs and actions we may find deeply troubling, whether they be family members, friends, neighbors, coworkers, social media connections, colleagues. Number two, how to cultivate compassion in a way that prioritizes our own mental health as well as our connections with others, and honors our own worldview and our own values, because there's a lot of misconception that cultivating compassion for other people, especially people for whom we don't have compassion, or people we think lack compassion, that if we cultivate compassion for them, that we are condoning things that are disagreeable to us, and nothing could be further from the truth. So I'm going to talk about that. Number three, how to understand the psychological differences between, and this is the elephant in the room, because this election just happened, and I know a lot of people are in dismay, and a lot of people are happy, but a lot of people are not, and a lot of people are afraid, and a lot of people don't understand. And so number three that we're going to talk about today is how to understand the psychological differences between conservative and liberal mindsets, conservative and progressive, whatever you want to call it. I'm calling it that. I'm calling it conservative and progressive, conservative and liberal mindsets, to help explain why people vote the way they do, why people think the way they do, why people act the way they do, especially when it comes to the causes we care about. And on that note, how to use that understanding, this is number four, how to use that understanding to refine our message so that we can communicate and advocate effectively at the social level, with our friends, with our family, with our coworkers, the cultural level, and even at the legislative level. And then finally, how we reconcile our feelings for the people we care about with the policies and politicians we strongly oppose, but they may favor. Now, in a future episode and in conversation with subscribers and supporters, I am going to delve more deeply and more specifically into what policies and laws might mean for animals, wildlife, farmed animals, habitats, and, of course, environmental issues under a second Trump administration, and speculate what they might have been under a Harris presidency based on the Biden-Harris administration track record. And at that time, I'm also going to address specific local and state pro-animal initiatives that failed during this 2024 election, even in traditionally blue states, and reflect on what we can learn from those outcomes to inform future efforts. But today, we're going to look at the left-right divide in this country and around the world. Because what's happening in the United States is not unique to the United States. And I'll talk more about that when I get into the nitty-gritty about politicians and policymakers and policies. But we're going to look at this left-right divide that's dominating our discourse and what it means for animals and the causes we care about. Because when we understand the stories people tell themselves, the narratives they live by, the lenses through which they see the world, and the values and the fears and the concerns that drive them, we gain an invaluable understanding that allows us to communicate our own message effectively and craft campaigns, initiatives, legislation, conversation that genuinely resonate with the people we're talking to, so that we get them to at least be oriented in the same direction, so that we can create opportunities for meaningful and lasting change, because that's what we want, right? Now, if you've made it this far, by the way, kudos to you, because we're at a time when people proudly and outrightly declare that they don't want to understand why people voted the way they did, because that vote tells them everything they need to know about that person. And if that's where you're at, then you're probably not listening to this episode. And if that's where you're at, but you're willing to dip your toe into the possibility that there's another way to navigate this difficult road, then thank you for being here. I don't profess to have all the answers. I don't profess to have any of them. This is just my perspective. By the end of this episode, you might not agree. I may have made things worse, but I just appreciate that you're open to taking this ride with me and trusting me with the thoughts I have to share. And I too am trusting you, because even suggesting that we understand the other side is tantamount to putting my head on the chopping block. But I can't help it. I have never shied away from the more challenging work of seeking understanding in complex situations. That's why I wrote The Joyful Vegan, to explore why some people struggle being vegan, why some people stop being vegan, why people resist being vegan. Like when I talk about how to interact with a hunter and how to have conversations with people who seem so far away from who we are and what we believe in, right? Navigating how to engage with people we know might mistreat animals or contribute to violence against animals. I have never shied away from that. That has been the foundation of my work for the 30 years I've been doing it. It's called compassion, and it is what I have tried to do all these years, to orient to compassion. And you've heard me talk about it before, that compassion isn't compassion if we're just compassionate to those who agree with us. That's not compassion. And so before we get to this conservative liberal divide, I want to explain why I think it's valuable to even want to try and understand the perspective of another, even if that perspective is abhorrent to me and completely opposite of what I believe and how I see the world. You've heard me talk about this over the years a lot, including in this podcast, including in past conferences and workshops, and in my book, The Joyful Vegan, and other books. Let me read an excerpt to you from The Joyful Vegan, because I want to establish this as the foundation and the frame for this episode. And I also want to establish that I'm not talking about anything new here. This is a topic that I have talked about for years, compassion. So I know that there is a tendency for people on social media, especially, to say, stay in your own lane. Why are you talking about politics? And by the way, I'm not really even talking about politics on my social media channels. But I know there's a tendency to want to say that. Like, I'm following you because of veganism. I'm following you because of animal advocacy. And so I'm establishing here that for me, my work, the foundation has always been compassion. And it's always been about how to live as compassionately as possible, both toward human and non-human animals. And so I want to frame it in this way, in compassion. And so let me read a brief excerpt from The Joyful Vegan. We're all taught to compartmentalize our compassion and reserve it for only a select few, doling it out as one would limited, scarce rations, as if exercising it fully and authentically would deplete us of it or compel us to waste it on the wrong people. And so we actually wind up rationing our compassion. We decide who's worthy of our compassion and who it should be withheld from, who deserves it, and who it should be denied to. We see this play out in the ugliest of ways when animal advocates celebrate the death of hunters or prominent meat-eating celebrities, meat-promoting celebrities, cheering their demise in the name of compassion for animals. That's not compassion. That's vengeance. That's not kindness. That's insensitivity. Vegans also ration their compassion when they say, I'm not going to have compassion for slaughterhouse workers, animal farmers, animal abusers, hunters, people who test on animals, people who eat animals, and fill in the blank because they don't deserve my compassion. And we see the same rhetoric today, regardless of who you are and what side you're on. I'll continue. They use righteousness and ironically compassion as justification for their intolerance, forgetting that the people we think are the least deserving of our compassion are probably the ones who need it most. If someone violates, hurts, or kills someone else, human or non-human, it's an indication that they're lacking compassion, empathy, awareness, or consciousness. The solution isn't to withhold the very thing that's missing, compassion, empathy, awareness, consciousness, but to fill the lack with that thing. It doesn't matter who fills the void. What matters is that the void is filled. Less compassion in the world just means less compassion in the world. More compassion in the world means more compassion in the world. It's really that simple. Compassion is one of the most misunderstood emotions because the implication is that by having compassion for someone, especially someone you deem harmful or hurtful or deceitful, someone who lacks compassion, means that you're in agreement with them, or that you condone their behavior, or you condone their thinking, or you condone their values, or you condone their vote. Nothing could be further from the truth. So in that context, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Millions of people are declaring the conscious withholding of compassion for millions of other people because they voted for Trump, justifying their lack of compassion in the name of compassion. So some of the things that people are saying, I see, I hear, I read, they're evil, they're racist, they're sexist, they're homophobic. I don't need to understand a perspective that is evil and racist and sexist and homophobic. Why even legitimize those dangerous perspectives by trying to understand them? That's one thing I see. Why humanize a perspective that dehumanizes others? They know what they're doing, and it's unforgivable. Why waste my time on people who don't care about others? Their beliefs are too dangerous to even entertain. I've tried talking to them. They don't want to listen. They're the reason we're in this mess. Why should I reach out to someone who votes for him and try to fix things by understanding them when they are the ones who caused this mess in the first place? And clearly they lack compassion if they voted for someone like that. I mean, right? These are just all of the things that we are hearing, we are seeing, we are feeling, we are saying. And so in the name of compassion, many people are saying, well, if you support him, I don't care about you. I don't want to know you. You're either on the side of good or on the side of evil. If you're in his camp, you're clearly on the side of evil. I have no tolerance for hate. And if you voted for him, you're part of the problem. There's no excuse for voting for someone like that, period. And so some of what you're going to hear me talk about here is I'm not even talking about Trump. I'm not talking about him. We'll talk about him in another episode when we talk about the possible policies and laws and legislation, right, during the administration, the coming administration. And the past administration. What I'm talking about is the reaction to people who voted for him, because that's where the rubber meets the road. This is about our relationships with one another and how we see one another and how we interact with one another and how we talk to one another and how we talk about one another and if we talk about each other and all of that. That's what this is about, right? And we know how easy it is to have compassion for those who agree with us, who look like us, who vote like us. But if we profess to be compassionate people, It means we have to have compassion, strive to have compassion, be willing to have compassion for everyone, because, by the way, it is a cultivation. I'm not saying you just turn on this switch and you go, no, they're fine, they're good, it's great. That's not what I'm saying. And I never have. It's a cultivation, it's a practice. But it's an orientation we have to be willing to have. And so if we profess to be compassionate, it means we have to strive to have compassion for everyone, the guilty and the non-guilty, the kind and the unkind, the good and the evil, the people we like and the people we don't, the people in our tribe and the people outside our tribe, the human and the non-human. And yes, authentic compassion means having compassion even for those who appear to lack compassion. I will say this again, and if you're still listening, thank you, because I'm sure some people have already turned this off, because many people hear this and think that aspiring to have compassion for everyone, regardless of who they are and how they vote and how they behave and how they eat, means condoning inappropriate, dangerous, illegal, offensive, or violent behavior. They think it implies enabling abusive behavior or being a doormat or accepting, untrustworthy or toxic people in their lives. And that's not what compassion is about. Compassion doesn't condone bad behavior. It helps transcend it. But determined to signal that we oppose bad behavior or political positions or opinions different than those of our own tribe or our own hearts, we declare that we're not going to have compassion for whoever they are, because we argue they don't deserve it. And so to prove how virtuous we are, we withhold compassion. We ration our compassion and we decide who deserves it based on who we think is worthy of it. And we wonder why there isn't more compassion in the world. Compassion has nothing to do with someone else's behavior. It has everything to do with our own. We don't give compassion, show compassion, demonstrate compassion, cultivate compassion for someone because of who they are or aren't. We offer compassion despite who they are or aren't. Striving to live compassionately means we stop asking, are they kind? Are they good? It means we ask, am I? And I'm going to say that again and again until I die. And I know some of you have heard that. And maybe people will hear it even after I die, because maybe this podcast will go on. Okay, so like I said, this episode is not about this man called Donald Trump. And I did not vote for Trump. Let's put that on the table right now. There is nothing I like about that man. And it definitely challenges my compassion to include him in my loving kindness meditation in the morning. And I'll talk more about what it looks like to cultivate compassion for people who we find abhorrent. But for me, it is way too simplistic. It is way unhelpful. It is untrue. And it is ultimately counterproductive to conclude that the millions of people who voted for him are evil. I reject that outright. I have family members who voted for him. I know people who voted for him. And I would never call them evil, ever. People's beliefs and decisions and voting behaviors are shaped by a complex interplay of factors: their personal values, their cultural traditions, their political priorities, their lived experiences. And if we dismiss or vilify them without understanding these underlying influences, we risk further polarization, which benefits no one, least of all the animals we're trying to help. And I know some people will hear that and say, well, I don't care if we're more polarized. I don't want to be in relationship with or in the company of people who support him. So I don't care if I risk further polarization. And I understand that reaction. Believe me, I understand why you feel that way. When someone's beliefs or actions feel so deeply harmful, the instinct is to distance yourself completely. And you can do that. You don't have to be in relationship with someone you feel is abusive or toxic or harmful or hurtful. That's not what I'm saying. But it's a mistake to believe that moving toward understanding someone's beliefs and behavior means that you're moving toward agreeing with them or condoning their behavior. Having understanding and compassion doesn't mean agreeing with someone or excusing their actions. It means recognizing that their perspective exists. And it's a valid perspective. It's not one you share, but it is a perspective. And that perspective, just like your own, is shaped by experiences and fears and concerns and beliefs and ideologies that may be vastly different than your own, but they're theirs. It requires curiosity rather than judgment. It requires courage to step back and say, this is really hard. I don't know what to do with this, but I'm willing to ask why, instead of just deciding that they're wrong and you're right, that they're bad and you're good, that they're evil and you're virtuous, right? And what is one of the problems with this? So, okay, you don't care about polarization. Well, one of the problems is it doesn't feel good to cultivate hate. It doesn't feel good to cultivate animosity. And you have to cultivate it in order to stay angry and to create separation and to be over here when they're over here. It takes energy and effort, and it's toxic and it's harmful, because when you cultivate judgment and animosity and loathsomeness, when you cultivate that, it just creates emotional unease and stress and anger, negativity, resentment. And sorry, but that disrupts our own inner peace. I don't want someone else. I said this to my subscribers in a private video, which is available to all of you who are subscribers. I said, one of the things I was saying to myself when I was, my stomach was turning was, I don't want, fill in the blank of whoever this person is, whether it's Trump or someone who is just, you just don't like. I don't want them in my head. I don't want them in my heart, and I don't want them in my home. I don't want them living here. So for me, it is also about not only trying to understand each other so we can come closer to each other, but it is about me not disturbing my own inner peace. So that's a motivation, if that is helpful for you or if that resonates with you. But also from a practical standpoint, it's more effective to cultivate compassion than to cultivate fear and loathing. It's more practical to cultivate empathy, right? And I've talked about this a number of times in terms of how I cultivate it, which is in the love and kindness meditation and journaling and things that I do. And you can listen to other podcast episodes on that. When we are focused on cultivating compassion, especially for people we have trouble having compassion for, the focus is on me and how do I want to orient to the world rather on them and the guilt that I see in them. So this isn't a one-time decision. As I said, it's not a light switch. It's a regular practice that you incorporate, and that can be really hard. But in the end, what happens from that is that we not only feel more inner peace, we actually have our own mental wellness to consider. But when we're focused on someone else's behavior, we're not focusing on our own. And when we cultivate animosity rather than compassion, we hinder our ability to identify and sustain hope that we need to have in order to do the work in the world that solves the problems we identify for people, for animals, for our planet. So it doesn't feel good personally, but it's also just not practical. We are not going to be able to create systemic change in this world without the masses. We need the numbers. If we just think we're going to, change the world with just, a kind of a small club of people who agree with us and who we like and whose voting record we approve of, it's just not going to work. And so that's why if we genuinely want to create meaningful change for the people, for the animals, for the earth we say we care about, we must be willing to understand why people think, vote, act, and eat the way they do. Only by doing so can we adjust our tactics, our strategies, our messaging, our language to be more effective. If we fail to meet people where they're at and instead label them as adversaries and hopeless adversaries that we'll never be able to reach, then we're only going to drive them further away from considering our perspective, especially if that perspective is different than theirs on the surface, right? Pro-animal perspectives, pro-environment perspectives, etc. Because how can we possibly craft messaging about the issues we care about if we don't know where someone else is coming from? We're just going to keep missing the boat. Like it's just not going to land. So it's just not practical, okay? So that is what I have to say about that. Number one, about why it's imperative that we at least orient to being willing to understand, not agree with, but understand someone else's perspective. That's what I wanted to say about that. Compassion is not complacency, okay? And now let's talk about where we are here in 2024, a time when the deep divisions within the United States and across the world, but I will focus on the United States, are undeniable. And I do not deny that there is polarization, but I do not agree that we are more divided than ever before. And let me tell you why. Don't turn this off yet. I'll tell you why. Does anyone remember the Civil War that ended in 1865, that tore apart this country because of political and economic and moral disagreements over slavery? The divisions were so profound that upwards of 750,000 people were killed, fellow Americans killing each other, fellow humans killing each other. Now, maybe using the Civil War as a barometer is a low bar, but that's a level of polarization that dwarfs anything we see today. I know people are saying that there's going to be a Civil War. I think there's a movie that kind of uses it as an allegory. We are not in a Civil War right now. And my point is, sure, maybe we'll get there. I don't know. I can't predict the future, but we are not there today. And the rhetoric that we're more divided than ever before, I just think doesn't match the history. Then you had the McCarthy era of the 1950s. Anyone listening who was around for that? When the fear of communism stoked paranoia and division in this country. Joseph McCarthy, senator who led a campaign of accusations and public trials, ruining lives, ruining careers with no evidence. The Red Scare that deeply divided communities and families and institutions, creating an atmosphere of fear and mistrust that was palpable across the nation. Not good. And then you have the 1960s and the 1970s. That was an era of immense social and political upheaval. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, generational clashes that left the nation deeply fractured. Protests, riots, political violence were constant. Assassinations. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King in 1968, Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, marked one of the most tumultuous and divisive periods in American history and shook the country to its core. And even national political conventions, the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, were marred by violence and chaos. So even today, with the violence, and there is violence, I'm not denying that there is, and the deaths, I'm remembering January 6th and the people who were killed that day, and heightened hateful rhetoric from both sides of the divide, frankly, I think it's important to acknowledge that we are not in a civil war or an all-out bloody conflict with each other yet. Tensions are high, divisions feel deep, but we are not in a total societal collapse where we're all turning on each other in organized combat yet. And if we want to avoid that, Who do you think is going to do that? It's up to each one of us. Who do you think is responsible for avoiding that kind of violence and conflict? Each one of us. It's not a mandate. It's not going to be a policy or legislation. It is up to each one of us to keep in check what we need to so that we don't further this divide. Unless you want a civil war, I personally don't. Now, I also wonder if the polarization and the division doesn't feel more pronounced because of the ways modern communication, media, social media amplify them. We have these echo chambers where people rarely encounter views that challenge their own. I mean, there was a time when, people would watch the same news stations, right? And news stories and news shows, right? Everyone watched the same thing. Walter Cronkite was the most trusted person in the United States. And then people could kind of decide for themselves what they thought and what they believed and where they were on the spectrum and, but still interacted with people who might not have voted the way they did. We just don't have that as much today because it's fostering these echo chambers where we don't encounter views that challenge our own. And it sensationalizes extreme viewpoints. That's what the media is for. And so these extreme viewpoints are given a disproportionate platform. This 24-hour news cycle, this partisan media further exacerbate this, framing issues in ways that deepen ideological rifts. And additionally, the speed at which information and misinformation and disinformation spreads today can make division seem relentless and unresolvable. In the past, disagreements were slower to unfold, allowing more time for reflection or resolution. Today, it's immediate and constant, creating the impression that the nation is more polarized than ever. I'm not saying there's not polarization, right? History reminds us that division isn't new or unique to this era, but the way polarization manifests may have changed, and the challenge of bridging divides feels hard and heightened and worse than ever before, but it remains the same. And so it requires us to create space for dialogue, understanding, and efforts to bridge divides before they escalate further. It's the same solution if we want it. And that's what troubles me more than anything, is that people talk about division, but then they take their place on one side and entrench even further. They write off each other in ways that only deepen the rift, as we discussed earlier. And I see it all the time. When I suggest on my platforms that we try to understand the other side, the response is that not only is there no point in understanding someone who supports bigotry, but that even by suggesting it, I am complicit in bigotry, right? There's no room for anything if you just literally leap to the conclusion that anyone who supports Trump is Hitler. I mean, where is there any room for anything? Okay, all right. That just it's not helpful. It's just not helpful. And so we just get trapped in these echo chambers where the outcome is just deeper division, even among the people who are your allies. So we have to want it. We have to want to understand. And so let's talk about what these mindsets are. I want to paint a picture of the mindset of a conservative and the mindset of a liberal, while holding the awareness and asking you to be mindful also that it's not a pure dichotomy. We're talking about conservatives generally and liberals, generally, but also we're talking about kind of Republicans and Democrats, right? And both major parties in the US have always encompassed a spectrum of ideologies. There's always been a far left to center left among Democrats. There's always been a moderate to far right among Republicans. But I also want to talk about the other elephant in the room, which is that it cannot be denied that Trumpism has profoundly transformed the Republican Party. And this shift makes it a little difficult to discuss Republicans or conservatism in traditional terms. But I'm going to still try. And as I provide these differences of ideology, of values, I really want to encourage you to listen without judgment. And I know that's really hard to do because you have your own biases. I do as well. You have your own ideology. You have your own tribe. You are part of one or the other, most likely. And so it's difficult to do, but I want to invite you to try and listen without inserting your own biases of one being better or worse, one being right or wrong, one being harmful or helpful, right? I want to invite you to listen with a kind of objectivity that will help, I think, in hearing what I have to say right now, but also moving forward to implement this understanding in your life, in your relationships, in your advocacy. So historically, conservatism emphasized principles like small government, fiscal responsibility, and a commitment to tradition and moral order. That was traditionally what conservatism embraced. It also supported the idea of personal responsibility, individual freedoms, and respect for established institutions. Many conservative leaders played critical roles in building and maintaining global alliances such as NATO and crafting international agreements aimed at fostering cooperation, security, immigration, and trade. However, the rise of Trumpism has reshaped the party's identity, prioritizing populist nationalism, loyalty to the leader, and a more confrontational stance on cultural and political issues. So Trumpism has definitely reshaped the Republican Party. There's no denying it, introducing this more populist tone that departs from many traditional conservative ideals, but the broader conservative worldview, emphasizing structure and authority, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, continues to influence many who align with the party. So let's take a look at this more closely. Conservative and progressive thinkers approach the world through fundamentally different lenses that shape their values and priorities and perceptions. And these differences influence not only how they view animals, but also how they view animal advocates, how their attitudes, what their attitudes are toward veganism, plant-based diets, alternative proteins, cellular agriculture, environmental issues, right? So conservatives typically emphasize tradition, hierarchy, individual responsibility, prioritizing stability, personal freedom, and moral order. That's kind of the traditional construct of a conservative view. They often view change with skepticism, especially when it challenges long-standing norms or institutions. I mean, it's on the tin. The very word conservative reflects the desire to conserve or preserve what already exists. It inherently suggests a resistance to change. The name itself conveys a mindset focused on safeguarding the present or returning to a perceived better past, rather than embracing transformation or uncertainty. Okay, that's your traditional conservative mindset. Progressives, on the other hand, value empathy, equality, systemic change, like it's on the tin. It's all about change and moving forward and progress and advancing and improving. Change is on the tin. That's a fundamental difference between progressives and conservatives. Progressives focus on collective responsibility and the need to address social and environmental injustices. Okay? It reflects a mindset focused on change and innovation and the belief that society can and should evolve to become more equitable, inclusive, and just. Those are two completely different visions of the world. One is not better than the other. They are different. And I invite you to dwell on that for just a moment without judgment of either. Just dwell on the differences without judgment, without subjectivity, without opinion, without bias. Just rest in that idea for a moment that at their core, conservatism and progressivism represent two opposing views of the world. One focused on preserving or returning to the past, but preserving the present, and the other focused on moving forward and embracing change. Those are two very different perspectives. And what I want to submit to you is that a healthy society, and especially a healthy democracy, thrives on the dynamic tension between opposing worldviews. It's a push and pull. It's a constant negotiation between preserving what works and striving for progress. Sometimes one perspective prevails, sometimes the other does, and that's the essence of democracy. No side dominates forever. You don't want it to. That's called dictatorship, right? So that's not what you want in a healthy democracy. Now, my job, your job, depending on what doesn't even matter what you think. If I want to further change, if I want to innovate, if I want to see change, then my job is to make the strongest, most compelling case for the values and the policies that I care about so I can persuade the masses, right, to vote for the thing, the person, the ideas, the policies that I believe are better. And we all have that opportunity all the time in the democratic institutions that we all value, such as free press, free speech, the right to vote, right? It's messy, it's imperfect, but it's what a democratic society looks like. And again, we'll talk more about this when we get into the nitty-gritty of the administration itself. But in fact, there is evidence that should suggest, and you can see this if you look back at the last several decades, even, or only, that the American public tends to shift in the opposite ideological direction of the party in power. It creates this pendulum effect. When conservative leadership dominates at the federal level, public sentiment often moves toward more liberal views and vice versa. And it's a phenomenon that reflects a natural balancing act in a pluralistic democracy where dissatisfaction with perceived overreach or unmet expectations by one party fuels a counter-reaction from the public. Over the last several decades, you can see this pattern in shifts like the Reagan era following the liberal activism of the 1960s and the 1970s, the Clinton presidency after 12 years of Republican rule, the rise of Obama after the Bush years, and the swing to Trump following Obama and again following Biden. And don't forget that Biden was voted in after Trump. So it's just something I want to highlight. So conservative values emphasize tradition, stability, personal responsibility, limited government. The focus is on preserving what has worked in the past, maintaining order, and valuing individual effort over collective solutions. And this worldview prioritizes hierarchy and discipline and a sense of moral clarity rooted in established norms. And these principles align closely with George Lakoff's theories on political framing, particularly his concept of the strict father model, which he argues underpins much of the conservative thought and influences how policies and priorities are shaped. And I talked about this in one of my Compassion in Action conferences. I think it was the one in 2017, where we talked a lot about his book. So George Lakoff, by the way, he's an author. He's a cognitive linguist. He wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values and Frame the Debate, which provides a really powerful framework for understanding the ideological divides between conservatives and progressives. And his work focuses on how deeply ingrained metaphors shape our political worldviews, our values, and our communication styles. And so he argues that these differences are rooted in contrasting family models. So that's his construct. And these family models, he argues, influence how people perceive the role of government, authority, and societal responsibility. So his strict father versus nurturant parent model illustrates these distinctions. So conservatives, he argues, tend to align with the strict father model, which emphasizes discipline and hierarchy and personal responsibility, as I keep saying. And in this view, the world is seen as a challenging place where clear rules, authority, and self-reliance are necessary for success and moral character, okay? And it is a model that then can tip more toward authoritarian rule. Progressives, on the other hand, align with the nurturant parent model, which emphasizes collaboration and collective care. This perspective views society as interconnected, thriving when individuals and communities support one another. So understanding these foundational metaphors, I think as advocates, as people, as members of society, we can better frame our messaging to resonate with the values of each group, whether it's appealing to responsibility and tradition for conservatives or emphasizing justice and systemic change for progressives. So These insights, I think, offer a lens through which we can explore how these worldviews influence attitudes toward animals, toward plant-based eating, toward environmental issues, and it helps us craft strategies that foster meaningful dialogue and action, yes, but actually progress. Like, that's the point. So let's unpack this even further, because based on these worldviews, conservatives and liberals view the world through fundamentally different lenses that shape their attitudes toward animals, vegetarianism, veganism, plant-based proteins, the environment, all of it. And it's important to understand this because different groups are going to respond to different appeals based on their core values. And the message that resonates with one group may fall flat or even alienate another. This doesn't mean that we compromise the message, but that we tailor it to meet people where they're at. And we address their specific concerns and priorities, even if they're not our own. That's what it means to be an effective advocate. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Effective advocacy requires understanding there are differences and crafting the strategies we need to craft to align with the values of each group, while staying true to the goal of protecting animals. That's what my goal is. I know it's what your goal is. My goal is to inspire people to live as compassionately as possible. And so let's look at how these two groups view animals in light of everything we've just talked about. So progressives, liberals tend to see animals as deserving rights and protection, though the depth of this belief varies because not everyone who's liberal actually sees that. But the idea is that there will be a focus on rights, on welfare, so again, depending on where you are in the spectrum, such as improving conditions, and others advocate for systemic changes. But the point is that rights and welfare and collective responsibility for a vulnerable group is in alignment with the liberal mindset. Conservatives, on the other hand, often view animals through a utilitarian lens, valued for their role in farming, hunting, or economic contribution. There is support for humane treatment. It's not that they don't have compassion, but it's usually framed as a matter of personal responsibility rather than moral obligation, and certainly rather than societal obligation, societal collective, solutions. So campaigns that challenge traditional practices such as hunting or farming may face resistance, especially if they're perceived as attacks on personal freedom or cultural heritage. So again, right or wrong, that doesn't matter. What matters is understanding, that's the lens through which that person is looking. That's why they're choosing that over that, because that's the lens, right? And so what does that mean for messaging animal issues? If conservatives view animals through a lens of utility and tradition and stewardship, which also means control and hierarchy, okay, understand that means they may resist messaging that challenges deeply rooted cultural practices like farming or hunting, or feels like government overreach. It's not that they don't value kindness or humane treatment of animals, but what will resonate more is responsibility rather than, personal responsibility to even personal ethics, rather than a moral right for animals. And so knowing our language and our rhetoric and our framing when we are, maybe not even addressing that group, but I'll tell you, everybody's paying attention. So if we want our messaging to resonate with a wider swath of people, we want to be mindful of how our language, our words might land, right? It's not about what you say, it's about how it's heard. And so, it is also about what you say, but and so what we want to be mindful of is how what we say lands, not just that we say it, right? Do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? So effective messaging suggestions might be stewardship and responsibility, right? So framing animal protection as a matter of ethical stewardship, emphasizing that humane practices reflect human dignity, human responsibility. So that's one approach. Highlighting efficiency and economic benefits. So humane practices or reduced reliance on animals in testing, for instance, or farming can lead to cost savings, improved product quality, reduced waste. So those are things to consider. For traditions like hunting or ranching, acknowledging their cultural significance while introducing the idea of modern ethical practices, right? So that we can preserve traditions without harming animals. There's lots of ways to talk about cultural heritage while also advocating for, not being violent against animals, not contributing to violence against animals. So there's a lot to do there around cultural heritage. What it also means is avoiding certain things, avoiding moralizing language that appeals to intrinsic animal rights, which may be dismissed as ideological, avoiding framing animal protection measures as government mandates, which could be seen as an infringement on personal freedoms, avoiding appeals to empathy without responsibility. So conservative values emphasize personal responsibility and discipline. So messages focused solely on the emotional suffering of animals may be dismissed as overly sentimental or irrelevant unless it's tied to broader responsibilities, such as stewardship or protecting societal order. Avoiding criticism of cultural practices and traditions, right? Framing animal protection as a rejection of hunting and farming and other long-held practices without acknowledging their cultural significance or even personal significance for the person you're talking to can create defensiveness or resistance. And finally, this applies to whether we're talking about animal issues or plant-based foods or environmentalism, especially. I would say it would apply mostly to animal issues and environmentalism, is to avoid catastrophic or doomsday language. Catastrophic messaging can be counterproductive because it often triggers skepticism or defensiveness, especially if it seems exaggerated or alarmist. I think this is a general rule for whoever you're talking to, and some of these things are for whoever you're talking to. They're not only for conservative thinkers. But if conservative values are about stability and order and practical solutions, dramatic or apocalyptic language can feel destabilizing and untrustworthy. So focus on messaging that's grounded, that's pragmatic, that's solution-oriented. Frame the need to protect animals in a way that preserves order and ensures sustainability and upholds personal responsibility. So that approach is more likely to resonate. Again, whether you're like having a one-on-one conversation or you're writing for a conservative newspaper or you're writing for any newspaper, to be honest, because you want to consider a wider audience, or you're drafting legislation because you need a lot of people, and we're going to talk about this in the subsequent episode about, a lot of anti-farming and anti-slaughterhouse bills failed here in Sonoma County, not far from me. 15% of the public voted to abolish slaughterhouses in Sonoma County. Well, that's not, 85% voted to keep them. So the point is, we want to make sure that we're being strategic in our messaging and in our choices for initiatives when we're thinking about how we want to move forward for animals. So messaging should align with conservative values, emphasizing everything we just talked about. Now, how these groups view vegetarianism and veganism and what's called alternative proteins. I hate the word alternative in this context, but plant-based proteins, right, in the marketplace. So research indicates notable differences in attitudes toward plant-based diets and veganism across the political spectrum. Research indicates that dietary choices such as vegetarianism and veganism are more prevalent among Democrats than Republicans. A 2018 Gallup poll found that 11% of liberals identified as vegetarian and 5% as vegan, compared to only 2% of conservatives identifying as either. So this suggests a correlation between political ideology and the adoption of plant-based diets, with liberals more inclined to adopting vegetarianism and veganism than conservatives. So what does that mean? I know it's tempting to say that liberals and progressives are more concerned about their own health. I don't think that's true. So what could it suggest based on what we've been saying? Well, conservatives may be less open to vegetarianism and veganism because of a strong value on tradition, where meat is central to culture and family, right? And the past and tradition. And there's also an association of vegetarianism and veganism with liberal or progressive movements. So I think we can all identify with, if someone's associated with this thing, we want to reject the thing outright, right? Because because we all do that. There's also resistance to change, as I mentioned, in terms of that kind of mindset. And there's also a skepticism of the arguments, the environmental arguments, the ethical arguments. So traditional notions of masculinity, I think, also play a role. Religious beliefs about dominion over animals, I think, could reinforce meat consumption within conservative communities. So I think all of those are reasons to understand why there is more vegetarianism and veganism in kind of more liberal progressive communities, not because they care more, but because of everything I just said. So what does it look like to have effective messaging around that, right? First, highlight the entrepreneurial opportunities and economic benefits of plant-based and, plant-based foods and plant-based proteins, alternative proteins, right? The jobs these new foods are creating, helping American farmers, because, in the end, the farmers don't care what they're growing as much as that they are growing something that they can make money to feed their families with, right? So emphasizing agriculture and farmers and job creation, those are all things that are aligned with conservative ideals. Emphasizing consumer choice, and that's a big one, rather than mandating dietary shifts. People don't want to feel like they're being told what to do. Most people don't. But again, that's kind of through this conservative lens to understand that a bit more. And again, cost effectiveness in terms of it creating jobs, but also being a healthier, but also more practical, less expensive option, right? And also, I do think that, we can focus more on the innovation of American leaders, because a lot of the cutting edge food technologies are happening here in the United States. And so kind of talking about it, framing it as the US being on the forefront of these technologies. Avoid critiquing traditional diets. I mean, again, these are suggestions for anybody, whoever your audience is. Avoid telling someone that they're bad, that they're wrong, that they're morally repugnant, right? Really kind of tamping down our moral superiority. People don't respond to moral superiority. Tamping down our all or nothing approach. People tend to resist if the message feels like an ultimatum or demands perfection. So when we say that there's no room for, reduction, they have to be vegan or nothing, then that people don't respond to that very well. Avoiding scientific jargon. I think avoiding just jargon, just not placing yourself above someone else. And again, avoiding this catastrophic language, like, that our planet is just going to die in, 5 years if you don't go vegan, right? I mean, just avoiding that kind of language, instead talking about the positive aspects of eating plant-based and what it means for your health and what it means for your family and what it means for farmers, etc. Avoiding attacking tradition or culture, as we mentioned, and avoiding exclusionary messaging. I think we can talk like we're in some kind of exclusive club and that we're the only compassionate ones and they're not. So those are some of the ways to frame our messaging around plant-based eating among a lot of groups, including conservative groups. And then when it comes to environmental issues, right, conservatives prioritize economic stability, resource management, personal freedoms, and they often see environmental issues as secondary to those goals. They are more receptive to conservation efforts framed around stewardship, protecting resources for future generations, and animals are seen as resources to a lot of people, and ensuring economic benefits, so again, like job creation. And, a lot of the same messaging applies here, talking about job creation. I mean, it has to be said that the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in 2022 by Congress, by a bipartisan Congress, signed by President Biden, it's the most ambitious U.S. climate law in history, and it was signed into law in 2022. And since then, over 330,000 new jobs have been created. So that's a message to bring to any audience that you talk to, especially to people who would be inclined to hear that. It is not going to be easy to undo a law that where millions of Americans are benefiting by that law. It was the same thing with Obamacare. By the time they had power, they couldn't do anything about it. Didn't do anything about it. didn't have the political will, didn't have the votes, because people were benefiting by it. And so, millions of people have benefited from the more than $8 billion in IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits to help pay for energy upgrades like heat pumps and the cost of electric vehicles. So we'll talk more about that when we get into specifics. But the point is to talk about the things that matter to the people you are talking to. And please do not in any way mistake what I am saying as not being action oriented and active and fighting the fight that you want to fight. Do it. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be there, in all the ways I can be and have been, in the ways that I think I can be effective. None of this is about giving away our power. And I think that is the last thing I want to say about messaging and what we tell ourselves and what we're telling each other. I think the thing that alarms me the most when I see the language around the reaction to this second administration is so many people are talking like they don't have the power, and you are not powerless, and I am not powerless, and they are not all powerful. And I know it sounds like they are, or seems like they are, or that's certainly the power we're giving them, but that is not true. So take back your power and be strategic. And that's what this whole episode is about. It's about being strategic. And being strategic means understanding the landscape and the people in it. So claim your power, use your power, stop giving away your power, and I'm going to be right there with you. And then finally, listen. I know all of these things can apply. Please apply all the things that I said, and please read The Joyful Vegan to take a look at kind of communication strategies that I've been talking about forever. And you can find a lot of that content on the podcast as well. But when it comes to navigating political discussions with family, Thanksgiving is coming up, Hanukkah's coming up, Christmas is coming up, all of these holidays are coming up that will bring us together. And I know that there's people who are resisting being with people they, don't want to be around. And I just want to offer a thought about that. Everything I've been talking about and everything I've always ever talked about when it comes to communication is that how we think about someone or something dictates how we behave, and it dictates what we say. Our conversation with someone starts long before we open our mouths. It starts with how we think about them. So that was my intention, is to provide an understanding of the mindset of the people we might not agree with, but who might be in our family. And when it comes to navigating the political discussions with family during the holidays or any occasions that you find yourself in with people who have opposing views, apply everything I've ever talked about. Apply everything I've talked about here. Observing objectively, being curious, practicing active listening. That sound is Michiko scratching her little scratching post. Finding common ground, not assuming the worst about them, finding the values behind their decisions, and recognizing that different isn't evil. I'm not saying there aren't going to be policies and laws and rhetoric that is going to be abhorrent and offensive and dangerous and harmful. That is true. But I can tell you that everyone is a hero in their own story. And that is not the story that people who voted for Trump are telling themselves. They are not looking to create harm. They might do it in the policies that may be passed, but that is not what people are telling themselves about why they've made the choices they've made. And all I am suggesting is let's find out what those perspectives are so that we can understand and do something about it, and do something about our messaging, and do something about it in response, because that's what we're beholden to do, right? And honestly, what I would say about post-election conversations with family is you don't have to have them. I mean, you don't have to have the conversations. You have the family. You do have the family. That's your family. A long, long time ago, I made it very clear to my father, who doesn't vote, but if he voted, would vote for Trump. And maybe someone voted for him. Maybe he had a mail-in ballot. I don't know if they have them in Florida. My father comes from the gambling world. He has been an admirer of Trump for as long as I can remember. But even before Trump was on the political scene, this was not a person I ever wanted to, I never wanted in my home, my heart, and my head. Okay. And my father and I have clashed on politics and religion for as long as I can remember. And so a very long time ago, I made it clear to my father that we're not discussing politics or religion. And sometimes he tries to bring me in, and I go, no, I'm not going to do it. Because I know it's kind of tempting and it's kind of gratifying also to kind of have the fight. It's not gratifying or interesting to me at all. And so I just keep a very clear boundary, and I change the subject to something that's neutral. We talk about old movies, we talk about old actors. Like, I know a lot of old movies, more than he does, to be honest. I know a lot of movies from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And so my father and I will talk about that and actors and that kind of thing. These days, we we just talk about neutral things, very surface things. And that's okay. That's fine, because it means that we're not going to a place that's going to, in the end, just create more strife. And so if you have a very evolved family, you could just say, politics are left at the door. We're not even talking about politics. And find some neutral topics that you can all share. Memories of the past, plans for the holidays, travel plans. I mean, right? Just keeping things neutral. And that's your prerogative. And if things do become heated, if things do go in that direction, you can step back, you can walk away, you can do that. And I just think that preserving relationships is more important than winning an argument. So just be clear about what you want and what's important to you. And then get up, get out, get working, get active, get connected with the people who care about the causes you care about, and get to work. And just know that other people are doing the same thing. And we'll talk more about what we can do for the animals in another episode. For the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening. If you're still listening, thanks for listening.